website. And again, he was very accessible, right? So you'll find if you kind of, are able to find some open source software projects and it was really no different from anyone else that they've interacted with. Because I think a lot of the early users were people who used open source. And there's a lot going on kind of in the news of the world of Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin has changed from this project really when it was released that was worth nothing, right? Bitcoin had no value, to it was, almost 25 or 50 cents, coming up on the dollar. And there was finally kind of the first press interest in Bitcoin. So actually on December 10th, there's the first public news article about Bitcoin from PC World, and it's really about this idea that Bitcoin or a similar open source currency could be used to fund something like a WikiLeaks, which then was sort of a organization that was political outcast from the banking system, right? So WikiLeaks, famously headed by Julian Assange, had released videos of the U.S. atrocities in the Middle East and essentially found themselves blacklisted from the banking system. And, this was kind of news of the day. Bitcoin users were excited. They wanted to pitch Bitcoin as a solution. And, from what we know, Satoshi Nakamoto was a bit skittish about that. So one of his last messages is, the famous quote where he says something about, WikiLeaks has kicked the hornet's nest and now the swarm is headed towards us. So, one of his last communications is really about his worries about the Bitcoin project's success and then his personal stakeholdership in it. So, certainly that's really where the mystery begins, and hopefully that answered your question.
No, it definitely does. It definitely does. And I guess I don't want to really get into the who is Satoshi question so early on. So maybe we can talk, that can be a little bit later on in the space. I guess, so you mentioned that Satoshi still did have some private communications after his last public message. Who was he still talking to back then? Who was he still collaborating with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we only really have circumstantial evidence of that. Some emails have been posted by other developers, but from what we know, essentially, by December 2010, Satoshi was starting to really, become a bit more, hard to get in touch with. People were messaging him, he wasn't responding as much, but also, again, the project had just become so much bigger, and he had started to work with some other developers. And so, from their personal attestments, or attestations, he had sent them some emails, essentially said he was looking to step back from the project. He pushed them to step forward. And then really by, kind of late December 2010, you have the first lead maintainer who was not Satoshi, Mr. Gavin Andreessen, step forward. And really, it seems like, from Gavin's emails that he's released, Satoshi was pretty communicative, for the next few months. He wanted to transition the project over and for it to be successful. So, he did kind of look at different code that they were writing. He reviewed some things. He also, was pretty active in talking to them about all the press interest, right? Because again, this is really kind of Bitcoin's first mainstream moment. It kind of, we often talk about, Bitcoin becoming mainstream now, or when is it going to become mainstream? But, to those guys who were working on the project at the time, Bitcoin was really emerging from obscurity, right? It was essentially this, wacky kind of thing that was going on a mailing list somewhere with a few nerds. And, by 2010, it's starting to become mainstream, right? You're starting to get Forbes and New York Times kind of interested in the story. And again, it's like their narrative is very much focused on, who is Satoshi? What is this project about? How is it worth so much money? Because essentially, the whole, it sounds very quaint now, but, the market cap of all Bitcoin at the time, had just passed $1 million, so the value of all the units in the economy. So Bitcoin was then seen as something that was, having success. So it seems like, Satoshi was ultimately able to kind of transition the project over those developers, and then over time just became harder and harder to get in touch with. And then you sort of in April of 2011, you have the infamous kind of email message with Gavin Andresen, where Gavin Andresen says that, and again, this is all taking place privately, that he has accepted an invitation from the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency to meet them and talk about Bitcoin, and is essentially from that point on never heard again. So, the timeline really is, December 12th, 2010, you get the last public Satoshi message under this, period where, he's talking about WikiLeaks and some of the things that are happening there. He goes private. He starts to kind of work with the developers to make that transition happen. And then by April of 2011, really that's when Bitcoin's really kind of peaking in the mainstream, hitting $30. Economy's now worth millions. He completely disappears, and as never heard from again, from what we know.
And has he really never been heard from again? And the reason I ask that is you constantly see on Twitter and the news, like, this potentially Satoshi-linked wallet is moving coins around, it's doing this, it's doing that. So none of those stories are actually true, really.
Well, now you get into kind of the interesting thing, which is, one of the aspects of Satoshi that I think, most people kind of underwrite is that, don't value as much as it's hard to really prove that anything specifically was done by Satoshi, right? So kind of getting this idea of one of Satoshi's great accomplishments was that he achieved anonymity on the internet, right? 14 years later, nobody knows who Satoshi is. And essentially, the way that he was able to do that was through obscuring his identity, essentially, from what we know, he even went so far as to, register the websites anonymously, right? So he was someone who took great pains to his own personal privacy. So it's really hard to prove that something was done by him. So we have, we know that he set up the website, we know that he created his own emails, but, can you really prove that that email was sent by Satoshi himself or someone on the account? From what we know, it seems like he had control of his Bitcoin Talk user forum name, and he used that quite frequently to talk to users. Subsequently, what is interesting is some of these emails get compromised. So kind of as you go forward in time, there's some emails later on where it's not clear if it's Satoshi. Some of these email providers were actually recycling emails. So after a certain time, if the email was dormant, you could essentially repurchase it. And there's some belief that Satoshi, those accounts, they kind of fell victim to this over time. But yeah, so, it's hard to say. It's like, what is proof, right? What proves that something is Satoshi? For myself, I have my own standard for that. And I would say the last message that we know with pretty great certainty is likely from Satoshi is, on April 26th, 2011, he actually hands over a cryptographic key to Gavin Andresen, one of the Bitcoin developers. And I think we have a pretty high degree of certainty that that's Satoshi, because he was the only person who had the key. This was a key that kind of sent alerts to the Bitcoin system, and essentially for him to pass it over, he would have to personally give it up. So I think, when I kind of look at the whole body of Satoshi's work, I think, the Bitcoin Talk account, it's a pretty high degree of certainty that that is Satoshi, and all those messages are from him. He's talking to users, he's making updates to the software, and you can tell that when he writes something, and he says, I'm going to do this, the change happens in the software. So we know that, whoever's writing those messages, essentially was able to kind of push those updates to the users. And then kind of this final private message where he hands over the key, if you're going to trust cryptography, and if that's your high bar for, information, then, that's kind of the last message. And then, from there, you kind of have to get in this question of, how do you know someone is someone on the internet? And certainly with Satoshi, again, one of his huge accomplishments, I think, is that he has been so anonymous, right? So, how do you prove that he did something? You sort of have to ask questions about cryptography and kind of all the great things that make Bitcoin from that point.
So, again, without touching on who is Satoshi, sort of like a broader question, you've obviously done a lot of research. Like, you're able just to rattle off these facts and these dates and these times. Do you think that there's any reason why we should or should not be looking for him, like to unmask the man or the person behind the anonymous facade? Or is it more interesting just as a historical record to know all this information about this person, but to keep the identity secret for, the future of Bitcoin, for the integrity of the project going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say kind of a third response. I think it's important to research Satoshi because it's important to understand Bitcoin, and I think it's hard to understand the achievement of Bitcoin without